morning, the 9,614th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Women and Peace and Security, Sexual Violence in Conflict. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Albania, Andorra, Argentina, Australia, Austria, Bangladesh, Brazil, Bulgaria, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Denmark, the Dominican Republic, Egypt, El Salvador, Estonia, Ethiopia, Germany, Guatemala, Hungary, India, Indonesia, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Latvia, Liberia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malaysia, Mexico, Montenegro, Morocco, Myanmar, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Nepal, Panama, Poland, Portugal, South Africa, Spain, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Ukraine, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Ms. Niemat Ahmadi, Founder and President of Darfur Women Action Group, and Ms. Danai, Gurira, UN Women Goodwill Ambassador, award-winning playwright and actor. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following to participate in this meeting. His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, and Ms. Laetitia Courtois, Permanent Observer and Head of Delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross to the United Nations. It is so decided. I also propose that the Council invite His Excellency Archbishop Gabriel Caccia, Permanent Observer of the Holy See to the United Nations, to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to Document S 2024-192, the report of the Secretary-General on conflict-related sexual violence, and Document S 2024-111, a letter dated 16 April 2024 from the Permanent Representative of Malta to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary-General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I now give the floor to Ms. Pramila Patten. The floor is yours.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to express my sincere appreciation to the Government of Malta for its strategic leadership in convening this open debate. I warmly welcome the participation of Mrs. Niemat Ahmadi, founder of the Darfur Women Action Group, and I commend her steadfast activism and commitment to the cause of peace. As we mark the grim milestone of 1 year since the resurgence of hostilities in the Sudan, her tireless advocacy has helped to to sustain a spotlight on the horrific patterns of conflict-related sexual violence exacerbated by the proliferation of arms. I further welcome the participation of UN Goodwill Ambassador, Mrs. Danai Gurira, who has powerfully lent her voice to this agenda. Mr. President, we meet today to consider the 15th annual report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence at a time when gender equality gains are being rolled back, even as militarization is being bankrolled at unprecedented levels, at a time when the world's resources are being used to feed the flames of conflict while women and children starve, at a time when military spending has soared to over $2.2 trillion while humanitarian aid budgets have been slashed, and at a time when weapons continue to flow into the hands of perpetrators while the vast majority of victims remain empty-handed in terms of reparations and redress. We also meet at a time when the pursuit of peace and gender equality has once again become a radical act. The essential, existential task we face is to silence the guns and amplify the voices of women as a critical constituency for peace. Yet, right now in the Sudan and Haiti, women and girls are being brutalized and terrorized by sexual violence committed at gunpoint. In Afghanistan, the systematic assault on and erasure of women and their rights is destroying lives and livelihoods. 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, thousands of displaced and refugee women and girls face a heightened risk of being preyed upon by traffickers. In the Middle East, women and girls are disproportionately affected by the ongoing bloodshed, displacement, trauma, and terror. They are among the many victims of the 7th of October attacks on Israel by Hamas, and they comprise more than half of the victims of the relentless bombing of Gaza, which has shattered the healthcare system, leaving survivors of gender-based violence, pregnant women, and others in desperate need with nowhere to turn. The report before us today provides a global snapshot of incidents, patterns, and trends of conflict-related sexual violence across 21 situations of concern. It records 3,688 UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed in the course of 2023, reflecting a dramatic increase of 50% as compared with the previous year. And this spike in recorded cases is particularly alarming in a global context where humanitarian access remains severely restricted and constrained. In 2023, women and girls accounted for 95% of the verified cases, with 5% recorded against men and boys. In 32% of these cases, the victims were children, with the vast majority being girls, 98% to be more precise. 21 cases were found to target lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex persons on the basis of their actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. While the report conveys the severity and brutality of UN-sourced and verified incidents, it does not in any way purport to reflect the global scale or prevalence of this chronically underreported, historically hidden crime. We know that for every survivor who comes forward, many others are silenced by social pressures, stigma, insecurity, the paucity of services, and the limited prospects for justice. Nearly half of the UN-verified cases presented in the report, 43%, were verified in settings where women protection advisors were deployed to convene the monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements on conflict-related sexual violence mandated by this Council through Resolution 1960 of 2010. For the first time this year, women protection advisors have also been deployed to a non-mission setting in line with Resolution 2467 of 2019, namely to Ukraine. In addition, the first regional-level Women Protection Advisor was deployed in 2023 to deepen engagement with the African Union and to monitor transborder dynamics and dimensions of the issue across the Horn of Africa. This year's report, Mr. President, includes for the first time a dedicated section on Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. Following the 7th of October attacks by Hamas, other armed groups, and armed civilians, I visited Israel at the invitation of the government. My team and I confirmed that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred in at least 3 locations and that sexual violence has been committed against individuals held as hostages and may be ongoing. Regarding the occupied West Bank, according to UN-verified information, the arrest and detention of Palestinian women and men by Israel security forces following the 7th of October attacks have often been accompanied by ill treatment, including forms of sexual violence. Similar allegations have emerged from Gaza. These findings in no way justify or legitimize further hostilities, and I continue to echo the calls of the Secretary General for a humanitarian ceasefire to end the unspeakable suffering of Palestinian civilians and to bring about the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. In terms of global trends, the report documents how sexual violence has curtailed women's access to livelihoods and girls' access to education amid record levels of internal and cross-border displacement. Women and girls face heightened levels of sexual violence in displacement settings as returnees, refugees, and migrants. For instance, in Eastern DRC, the climate of interlinked physical and food insecurity has driven many displaced women and girls into prostitution out of sheer economic desperation. In Ethiopia, reports surface of sexual exploitation in exchange for food, as well as continued sexual enslavement in Tigray in proximity to the compounds and barracks of arms bearers. Moreover, in many contexts, women with children born of wartime rape are often accused of affiliation with the enemy, excluded from community networks, and plunged into poverty. By contrast, sexual violence perpetrated with impunity remains profitable in the political economy of war. Conflict-driven trafficking in persons for the purpose of sexual exploitation continues to generate profits for armed and violent extremist groups. In Haiti, armed groups and criminal gangs continue to generate revenue through kidnapping, using the threat of sexual violence to extort ever higher ransoms. Sexual violence remains part of the repertoire of political repression used to intimidate and punish opponents and as a tactic to silence women actively participating in public and political life, notably in Libya and Yemen. The report further records a discernible trend of digital threats in Myanmar, where online harassment and hate speech specifically targeted women associated with the resistance movement and included the release of sexually explicit images and incitement to violence. This year's report, Mr. President, highlights an unprecedented level of lethal violence used to silence survivors in the wake of sexual assault. In 2023, reports of rape victims being subsequently killed by their assailants surfaced in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Myanmar, demonstrating the need to strengthen forensic capabilities, investigations, and accountability processes that ensure the protection of victims and witnesses. Frontline service providers and women human rights defenders were not spared. Armed actors threatened healthcare workers in Sudan, and reprisals against human rights defenders were reported in South Sudan, the DRC, and elsewhere. Across time and space, we see that the availability of weapons directly facilitates these attacks. Between 70 and 90% of conflict-related sexual violence incidents involve the use of a weapon, in particular firearms, according to United Nations research. In Eastern DRC, the threat of rape at gunpoint remains a horrific daily reality that overshadows the lives of women and girls, impeding their essential livelihood and sustenance activities. During one incursion into a village, fighters from an armed militia gang-raped 11 women, looted their belongings, and set fire to their homes. 4 of the women were mutilated and killed. The 7 survivors were taken to a health center but left without medical treatment as the clinic had been burned and raided. In the Central African Republic, women and girls tending farms and fields face the persistent risk of rape by roving armed actors in the area. In Haiti, women and girls traveling to work or school face the risk of collective rape by gang members armed with weapons largely trafficked from abroad. The accelerated withdrawals of peace operations from Mali and the Sudan have brought issues of transition and exit to the fore. Weapons management strategies are a critical part of preventing the occurrence and recurrence of conflict-related sexual violence in such settings. In 2023, I visited the border area between Sudan and South Sudan, where women and girls have been targeted for rape, gang rape, and abduction on the basis of their ethnicity, with the perpetrators emboldened by entrenched impunity. Since the resurgence of conflict in the Sudan, I have engaged with both parties listed in the annex to the annual report, namely the Rapid Support Service Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. These parties are required to take specific measures to prevent and address sexual violence. Moreover, all states must abide by the sanctions imposed by this Council, notably the arms embargo on Darfur, as part of efforts to achieve a comprehensive and sustainable peace. Excellencies, distinguished Council members, the report before us lists 58 parties that are credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of sexual violence in situations on this Council's agenda, the vast majority of them being non-state actors. Over 70% of listed parties are persistent perpetrators, meaning they have appeared on the list for 5 or more years without taking the requisite remedial or corrective action. It is critical to ensure coherence between the list of implicated parties and the measures imposed by UN sanctions regime. We must use these tools to stop the flow of weapons into the hands of perpetrators of sexual violence. There could be no more direct and effective way to disarm the weapon of rape and ultimately to prevent and eradicate these crimes. In terms of access to justice, far too many perpetrators of wartime sexual violence still walk free, while women and girls walk in fear. Left unchecked, these crimes set back both the cause of gender equality and the cause of peace. However, recent momentum in relation to transitional justice processes offers some glimmers of hope. For instance, the extension of the Special Criminal Court proceedings in the Central African Republic until 2028, and the decision by the Appeals Chamber to uphold a 2022 conviction for sexual violence by an armed group leader on the basis of command responsibility. The opening of Macro Case 11 in Colombia by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in September 2023 to investigate sexual and gender-based violence, including when committed on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And the approval by the government of Iraq in June 2023 to release $12 million to implement the Yazidi Survivors Law, pursuant to which some 1,600 applications for compensation have been approved, benefiting Yazidi, Turkmen, Shabak, and Christian women who were held in captivity by Daesh. In each of these cases, my team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict assisted the national judicial authorities, as well as providing technical support in other relevant contexts, including Guinea, Libya, and Ukraine. Urgent funding is needed for the conflict-related sexual violence multi-partner trust fund, which supports the work of both my team of experts and the interagency coordination network that I chair, UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict. Moreover, women protection advisors are a linchpin of our operational response, and their capacity must be consolidated and reinforced, including at critical moments of mission transitions and drawdowns. Mr. President, illicit arms flows have a chilling effect on women's ability to mobilize for peace. Less than 1/3 of voices heard in arms control and disarmament forums are those of women. This glaring gender imbalance reflects women's continued lack of influence over the peace and security processes that affect their lives. Yet, robust frameworks are in place, such as the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons of 2001 and the Arms Trade Treaty of 2013. Yet to date, no member state has publicly denied the export of arms or ammunition on the grounds that they could be used to commit or facilitate sexual and gender-based violence, though these instruments require a systematic assessment of that risk. In terms of the way forward, the report before us recommends targeted action to curtail the flow of weapons by ensuring, 1, full implementation of relevant legislative and policy frameworks. 2, gender-responsive disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration strategies, and security sector reform through effective oversight, accountability, vetting, training, codes of conduct, and efforts to hardwire gender equality into their work. 3, sustaining gains made in terms of DDR and SSR during periods of transition and mission drawdown, particularly with respect to regulating the destabilizing accumulation and misuse of small arms and light weapons. And finally, ensuring the meaningful participation of affected communities, human rights defenders, and civil society representatives in all peace and security processes, including those related to arms transfers and exports, which have classically been gender blind. It is time to declare zero tolerance for all male delegations and deliberations in the security sector. Almost a quarter of a century since the adoption of Resolution 1325, women's inclusion must be understood as an obligation, not merely an aspiration. Excellencies, today we know more than ever before about the factors that either enable or restrain the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence. We know that illicit weapons cast a long shadow over the lives of innocent civilians, while emboldening those who seek to spread fear and pursue criminal aims. Today's debate brings into focus the need to better align the CRSV and arms control agenda as part of prevention and risk mitigation. Mr. President, we cannot condemn the perpetrators of sexual violence in our speeches while continuing to fund and arm them through our supply chains. For decades, we have heard survivors of conflict-related sexual violence say that that man had the gun and he had the power. Recently, we documented the case of a 19-year-old Haitian woman in Cité Soleil, accosted by masked men who put a gun to her neck, dragged her into a field, and raped her and beat her while pressuring her to confess an association with men she did not even know. In 2023, the UN documented the case of a 60-year-old woman in Tigray, northern Ethiopia, who was gang raped at gunpoint by 3 soldiers while she was hiding in a field near her home. A frontline service provider in Unity State, South Sudan, reported to my office, the youth are now accustomed to carrying weapons wherever they go. Those who have weapons are the ones threatening people and perpetrating sexual violence. Mr. President, this makes disarmament a key step in prevention. Indeed, we cannot address sexual violence without shifting power dynamics. Starting today, we need women in the room, weapons under regulation and embargo, money for human rights defenders on the table, and change on the ground. This includes supporting the courageous civil society activists who speak truth to power wielded at gunpoint, never allowing threats to silence them. In this respect, we must be on guard against any cynical recourse to suppression and exclusion, supposedly in the name of protection. The aim of this agenda is participation and rights, not paternalism and control. Women in the war-torn corners of our world need to see hope on the political horizon. Our words, deeds, and decisions in this chamber and beyond must give them cause for hope and must contribute to peace with justice, peace with gender equality, peace with dignity and development, peace that endures. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Patten, for your briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Niemat Ahmadi. The floor is yours.
Mr. President, Excellencies, civil society colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to address the Security Council today on conflict-related sexual violence. My name is Niemat Ahmadi, and I am the president and founder of Darfur Women Action Group. As a survivor of the Darfur genocide, I founded this organization in 2009 to empower survivors both in Sudan and in the diaspora and to prevent future atrocities. Today, I would like to recognize the resilience of the women of Sudan. Their stories of unspeakable suffering are only surpassed by the accounts of their courage and determination. It has been more than 1 year since Sudan was engulfed in vicious violence. While the rapid support forces are still occupying and looting civilians' homes, using sexual violence, including rape, sexual slavery as tactic of war, the Sudanese armed forces are launching heavy artillery shelling, air strikes, and indiscriminate attacks, mainly targeting civilians' homes, markets, bridges, essential public services, and evacuation routes with no respect for human life. The cycle of violence in Sudan exhibits a total disregard for international law and may amount to crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. The conflict has so far killed between 10 to 15,000 people in Al Junaina, West Darfur capital alone, left over 10 million displaced, and condemned 18 million to starvation, with the UN warning that Sudan will soon become the world's worst hunger crisis. These statistics are just the tip of the iceberg. The actual numbers of casualties is sadly underreported, and it has been unsafe to collect data in the middle of the crisis. The conflict has ravaged Darfur, Khartoum, and Kordofan state, and the recent violent takeover of central Sudan and assault in al-Fashir could lead to deadly mass atrocities. The war has had devastating consequences for women. Thousands of women have been killed. Of the 25 million people facing a catastrophic humanitarian crisis, women are particularly impacted. Women also comprise up to 70% of the IDPs. Rape and other forms of gender-based violence are the defining features of the current war in Sudan. In January, the UN panel of experts on Sudan reported widespread and escalating conflict-related sexual violence in Darfur, including kidnapping, rape, and sexual exploitation of women and girls. The report underlines sexual violence committed by members of the Rapid Support Forces and allied militias in all areas under their control, and the targeting of women due to their Masalid ethnicities. This report has only confirmed the horrific accounts of sexual violence we have been hearing about for months against women from the Masalid, Four, and the Kao tribe, particularly in IDP camps. Some women have been told by their attackers that they should be happy that now they will have an Arab child. These atrocities, combined with incidents such as the recent massacre in Ardamata, West Darfur, indicate a clear pattern of ethnic targeting of the Masalid people and other African tribes. Excellencies, I am haunted by the horrific reports of sexual violence that I hear every day. One that shattered my heart and shook me to the core was that of Nora, who have endured gang rape at only 12 years old, leaving her in critical condition. Her family, struggling to survive, had to make an impossible decision, either to seek treatment for her or to feed her youngest sibling. Hearing this, Nora looked up in tears and told her mother she no longer wanted to live. These are choices that no family should ever have to make, and no child should ever have to endure. Nora's story is only one of too many. Women and girls have been raped multiple times, sometimes in front of their fathers, husbands, and sons in an effort to break their will and destroy their dignity. These women and girls have no protection, no access to humanitarian or medical assistance, and no way to turn for help. Attacks on medical facilities, restriction on communication, and deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid delivery by the warring parties are making it even more challenging for survivors to access life-saving services, including sexual and reproductive health services. We hear that there are less than a dozen obstetricians and gynecologists left working in Khartoum or other areas. To make the matter worse, the fear of retaliation for speaking up has made it impossible for many survivors to come forward. Yet, despite these dangers, grassroots and women-led organizations continue to be the lifeline for their people. They are helping their communities, documenting atrocities, and ensuring that international community keeps its eyes on Sudan. It is indeed their bravery that draws the bold line between hope and despair. But they cannot do it much longer without your help. Excellencies, this Council must not remain silent as the inhumane acts I have just described continue with total impunity. It is worth noting that without the spread of weapons, the levels of sexual violence we are currently seeing in Sudan would never have occurred. As the panel of experts reported to you, the warring parties in Sudan and their external enablers have continued to violate the Security Council arms embargo on Darfur. And as the USG DiCarlo told you last Friday, it is indeed illegal, immoral, and it must stop. Yet, the Security Council has thus far failed to explicitly condemn these violations or take any action to stop the actors abusing it, unless the Security Council calls out those who undermine the measures it has put in place, you are signaling to perpetrators that they can continue to violate international law without consequences. Ending impunity for past and present crimes, including crimes against humanity, crimes against women, must be a priority for the Security Council if we ever are able to achieve sustainable peace in Sudan. Therefore, I urge the Security Council to demand that all parties commit to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, stop the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and enable rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access in accordance with international humanitarian law. Demand that all parties immediately cease all acts of sexual and gender-based violence and hold perpetrators accountable. Prioritize the creation of a new and stronger UN presence on the ground for assuring civilian protection and humanitarian operation across Sudan and documenting violations of international law. Ensuring that women's rights are central to all criminal accountability processes. Make violations of women's rights and all forms of sexual and gender-based violence an explicit criterion for imposing sanctions. Maintain and enforce the current arms embargo in Darfur and expand it to the whole of Sudan and to all parties to the conflict. Demand and support the full, equal, safe, and meaningful participation of Sudanese women in all de-escalation, peace-building, humanitarian, and justice and accountability effort, and all political processes regarding the future of Sudan. Excellencies, 2 decades ago, when this Council first began to grapple with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Darfur, you did what was right. You mobilized humanitarian assistance, referred the situation to the International Criminal Court, set up a peacekeeping mission to protect the vulnerable, created a sanctions regime to designate and hold responsible those who violate international law, and impose an arms embargo where it was needed. Now, there is no UN mission left in the country. No new individuals have been listed under the sanctions regime, and your arms embargo is both limited and being flouted with impunity. In this current context, we see little solidarity with the people of Sudan. For more than 23 years, we have heard your promises to uphold women's rights and to end conflict-related sexual violence. Regrettably, these promises have yet to be realized. I reiterate today, all violations of women's rights, regardless of perpetrators or wherever they occur, deserve your condemnation and warrant action and accountability, be it in Gaza, in Israel, or in DRC, or Myanmar, in Afghanistan, or the many other conflicts where women pay the price of war. The international community's failure to act in my country, Sudan, and in all these other contexts should be a stain on our collective conscience. Only you have the power to change this. Please act now. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Ahmadi for her briefing. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Danai Gurira for her comments.
Distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. 80 cents. When was the last time you handled 80 cents? Paid for something that was all that it cost. It is not even enough to buy a packet of gum in this day and age, but it can buy you a child to rape at a so-called maison de tolérance in a camp for internally displaced people in eastern DRC. That is the world that we are still in, where conflict zones are terror zones for women and children. My first exposure to this dire issue came when I, as a playwright, started to seek to create a narrative that would amplify the voices of women and girls caught in the crosshairs of war. It was the Liberian Civil War. I was seeking their unheard voices, and it would become my Broadway play, Eclipsed. With the help of a friend at the UN, who at the time worked in the Children in Armed Conflict Office, I visited Liberia and spent time with women who had experienced unthinkable atrocity, who wished to be heard, to participate in the change process, to have a chance at a fulfilling life and heal from all that had been taken from them, who wanted justice. Now, I'm sad to say, 17 years later, the change we had all hoped for has not been won. What shocks me is how these crimes are being committed all around the world, how vast and widespread the issue has become. The report covers 25 situations, from Colombia to the Ukraine to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, Haiti, and closer to home for me, as a Zimbabwean, DRC, Ethiopia, Central Republic of Africa, and Sudan. This issue has now become prevalent for more countries, not fewer. The media is our primary filter for shaping our perception and understanding of the scale and the scope of these violations, but yet the reality of our news media is that they focus on some places, and certainly not the places where women look like me. This debate has to be a time when we hear from the courageous Sudanese peace builders like Niemat Ahmadi, where we hear and see the girl who's tied to a tree in Ethiopia. This debate is for that child in the brothel near the IDP camp in eastern Congo. We must acknowledge women and survivors all over the world. Nothing is more dangerous than crimes that are not acknowledged, crimes that are unseen and allowed to persist. I'm here today to amplify the voices of those who are never seen and heard, to acknowledge their suffering and to make sure they are not forgotten, and to hold those allowing this to continue responsible. Almost exactly a year ago, a civil war broke out in Sudan during Ramadan on April 15th. In this chamber, a remarkable Sudanese woman called Ala al-Karib told you that the first report of gang rape by armed men was reported at noon on that very first day in a woman's home in Khartoum, and quickly followed by 2 more in that same area of the city. And since then, the reports of sexual violence and sexual slavery have not stopped. Although the Democratic Republic of the Congo has featured in annual reports and annual debates every year, the number of victims and survivors continue to rise. Service providers and Doctors Without Borders have been assisting as many as 70 victims every single day from the IDP camps near Goma. In 2020, only 5 days after my first briefing with this council, civil war erupted in Ethiopia, where atrocities are shocking, with both Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers ruthlessly gang raping women, often in public, exhibiting them there, tied to trees. And impunity is pervasive. The common result, no justice for survivors, none. Estimates are that 10,000 survivors of sexual violence sought care in health centers, which is already a fraction of the total number of victims, because many survivors never seek care, and many others want to, but cannot find it. Khartoum, once a thriving city for African women professionals, now reports sexual violence targeting of women activists, professors, healthcare providers, and students. How do we effectively combat this issue? Malta has invited us to consider something that is part of the answer to the question. The guns. There are more services for survivors than before, more people working on this than before, but we are merely swimming against the tide, getting nowhere. And that tide is emboldened by 9 consecutive years of increased military spending, reaching an all-time high of more than $2.4 trillion. The actors committing sexual violence at such high rates in Sudan, the DRC, Ethiopia, or Haiti, to name a few, are armed to the teeth, flagrantly violating arms embargoes. And we hear so much about disruptions to the global supply chain, but the weapons keep flowing. When you set a stage, the players will come. I, as a theater maker, know this well. The military economy sets the stage. The players are well supplied and play their roles. Sexual violence is horrifyingly and intrinsically embedded in the stage directions of war. Why does it feel like things are getting worse? Even as the UN ramped up its efforts to address conflict-related sexual violence over the last decade and a half since I wrote Eclipsed. How can your words in this chamber or the UN's small programs in conflict areas compete with $2.4 trillion of military spending and record weapon sales? When we take all bilateral aid supporting feminist, women-led, and women's rights organizations and movements in conflict area countries, we do not get to $150 million for the last year for which we have data. Put another way, less than 0.01% of global military spending. The point is that reversing the upward trajectory of military spending would be a way of reducing the number of victims in need of support in the first place. The point is, working on arms control and ammunition management is also working to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. Arms are a part of the root of enabling these crimes. That is undeniable. But I must put forth, fewer weapons doesn't get at the heart of the psychosis of those who use this kind of violence. Diminishing its occurrence is not just about guns, though they definitely play a role that must be addressed. Simply put, sexual violence and conflict existed long before semi-automatic weapons. It has been used to break, dominate, and take power and control and to destroy since time immemorable. The pathology of it, an expression of a deep complexity and layers, and we have to target it at all levels and at all times. The issue that strikes me, shocks me, and always stood out as the one that requires far more strident steps than it currently has, as mentioned, is that of impunity. We see the documentation across the Secretary General's report, across so many testimonies from brave survivors, about the commander who committed the act, and he was let off due to his political power, his money, his intimidation, the soldiers who terrorized a home, a school, a community with no consequence, governments allowing their soldiers free rein to terrorize. This happens more times than we can count. As well as a gun issue, we have a deterrence issue. The issue of impunity, the knowledge that one can rape a mother, a daughter, a son, a child, and get away with it, feeds the pathology that keeps this issue dire and growing. We seem to not have found a way to create a deterrent that truly alters its perpetuation. Now, we know such deterrents exist, but the complicity around sexual violence being a spoil or inevitable consequence of war seems to deter various structures from truly holding parties accountable. Even though the ICC has taken up some cases of sexual violence, it is still largely cost-free to rape in the chaos of conflict. I'd like to speak to the governments here today who allow this to occur within their borders with impunity. If you refuse to protect your most vulnerable, but allow their bodies to be a spoil of your political conflicts, you should be held accountable, and you should not be in a position of leadership. Cultures of impunity, I can do this because I'm likely to get away with it, because it is the expected practice of war, must end. They need to be put through courts of justice. Accountability must be a given. We also need change of male-dominated cultures, where men are not holding themselves or each other accountable for committing these kinds of crimes, where leaders and their militaries condone this atrocity on their own citizens. For all the efforts to achieve gender justice over the past 2 decades, the shameful truth is that almost all perpetrators still feel they can get away with it. And the overwhelming majority of survivors never seek justice because justice is rarely ever there for them. Leaders of their own countries are not standing up for justice. They're not even condemning this horrific practice and seeing justice be served. We still haven't fundamentally changed the perverse equation that assigns more consequences to the survivor than the tormentor. Until we make it clear there are consequences for rape, real, dire consequences, we will never turn the tide of it. I want to ask member states in this room where this atrocity occurs, those member states who own state soldiers and perpetuate these occurrences, is this a default mechanism in conflict? Is fighting your wars on the bodies of your most vulnerable a tactic of war? What is being done, truly done, to prevent it, to bring justice, to deter future acts of atrocity? You must answer to this and to the girl in Ethiopia right now who doesn't know if she will make it through the week without being tied to a tree. Right now, a child in Eastern Congo needs us. Excuse me. To keep attacking this issue in multiple ways, including disarmament and impunity, and bringing truth to power. She needs us to be relentless and unstoppable, or she continues a life of unspeakable suffering, sold for a night for just 80 cents. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Gurira for her briefing. I shall now deliver a statement in my capacity as Deputy Prime Minister of Malta. I begin by thanking SRSG Patten for her dedication towards eliminating conflict-related sexual violence. My appreciation also extends to UN Women Goodwill Ambassador, Ms. Danai Gurira, and our esteemed CSO briefer, Ms. Niemat Ahmadi. As we convene today, as Danai just explained very clearly, global military spending has exceeded a staggering 2.4 trillion in 2023. Considering this, we converge on the crucial discussion of preventing conflict-related sexual violence through demilitarization and disarmament, fundamental UN principles that lie at the heart of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Today, our aim is to catalyze momentum and share best practices in levering arms control and disarmament strategies to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. It is also to increase women's leadership and influence in disarmament fora, where their voices are often underrepresented. The proliferation of over 1 billion small arms and light weapons globally fuels terrorism, organized crime, and conflicts. It also contributes directly to conflict-related sexual violence. This is why the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women mandates robust arms regulation. This is why the Arms Trade Treaty prohibits weapon transfers that have the potential to facilitate gender-based violence. This is why the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons recommends gender-responsive monitoring and analysis in national arms control mechanisms. WPS advocates must lead by example, by curbing military spending and halting arms exports to conflict zones. Malta was an early signatory of the Arms Trade Treaty, and we urge all remaining states to sign, ratify, and fully implement the ATT. The African Union's call to silence the guns deserves to be fully supported. Yet, as we have heard, in Sudan, illicit arms deliveries and complex financing networks are implicated in the systematic sexual violence against women and girls, whilst flagrantly violating the arms embargo. As we mark 1 year into this ongoing brutal conflict, no new entities have been listed, despite the panel of experts' detailed reporting of these egregious violations. Over 70% of listed parties in the SRSG's report have evaded accountability for years. In Israel and Palestine, as in the rest of the world, all acts of CRSV must be condemned and accounted for regardless of who committed them. In Afghanistan, we condemn the Taliban's systematic gender persecution and appalling levels of sexual and gender-based violence. This is why Malta supports the codification of gender apartheid, which would enable victims and survivors, present and future, to hold perpetrators to account for the totality of crimes committed. UN sanctions committees should incorporate sexual and gender-based violence as a standalone criteria. Gender expertise and briefings by the SRSG on sexual violence and conflict can advance the committee's work to deter violence by all parties, including mercenaries and private military and security companies. Women's rights defenders, like Ms. Ahmadi, exemplify courage and leadership. However, they remain unprotected and underfunded. This is especially true in the context of UN withdrawals, where civic space continues to narrow and where services are limited. Among the 21 countries covered in the Secretary General's report, the United Nations has deployed women protection advisors in only 8. We can do better than this, and we must do better. Conflict-related sexual violence must be central to ceasefire agreements, security sector reforms, and arms control efforts. Colombia's gender-responsive disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program offer a promising blueprint for preventing and responding to sexual violence in these contexts. Structural gender inequalities, poverty, and misogyny fuel CRSV. A collective response is needed to dismantle the patriarchal systems that limit women's full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation in all spheres: political, economic, social, and cultural. The new agenda for peace calls on us to challenge and transform entrenched gender norms and institutional barriers. Let us heed this call. Let us stand united to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence, ensuring that peace and security prevail for all. I thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank you for organizing this debate. Preventing conflict-related sexual violence. This is one of the most frequent, most serious crimes, and as we have just heard, almost always goes unpunished. We must change that. My thanks are also extended to the 3 speakers, and in particular, I would like to thank Ms. Ahmadi for her moving testimony and her courage, and also a note to the Sudanese women, we will not forget them. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is first and foremost a peace agenda. You have reminded us of this by placing disarmament and demilitarization at the heart of this debate. It has also been emphasized that the gender dimension of disarmament and arms control is anchored in a solid normative framework, which the international community must, however, make better use of systematically. The pioneering nature of the WPS agenda lies in the union of the 3 pillars: prevention, protection, and participation. These pillars are not only mutually reinforcing, but they can all be strengthened through disarmament and arms control. Allow me to address this specifically. First and foremost, prevention. In order to prevent the illegal trade and the misuse that fuel violence in general, and gender-based violence in particular, the flow of arms must become more accountable and transparent. To that end, a number of concrete avenues exist. As discussed at an area meeting hosted by Switzerland last month, we need to make better use of the CEDAW recommendations. These recommendations have historically called for accountability of arms exports in contexts where gender-based violence is prevalent. We also need reliable information to build capacity for early warning, rapid action, and accountability. Data on the use of weapons and ammunition, including diverted weapons and ammunition, needs to be more widely collected. Data collection and monitoring capacity must be a priority for UN missions, particularly in transitional contexts. At the national level, we must integrate disarmament and arms control into the 1325 action plans and integrate a gender-based approach in our disarmament strategies. Mr. President, the prevention of violence and the eradication of gender-based violence are also hampered by the persistence of discriminatory social norms, often associated with harmful models of masculinity that link the exercise of power to the carrying of weapons. These norms widen the participation gap, preventing women from fully contributing to decisions concerning peace and security without fear of being targeted or having their role and actions systematically questioned. In this sense, women's participation in the decision-making processes must be increased in forums dealing with disarmament, arms control, and the arms trade. This also applies to the management of new weapons and the use of AI in the arms industry. Women's participation is essential to transform the gendered power dynamics that fuel violence. And finally, I would like to turn to the protection pillar, recalling the need to make better use of the tools defined by the normative framework to protect the civilian population from violence and weapons. A large number of weapons and munitions are still being transferred and diverted to several of the countries mentioned in the SG's report, and this despite the very high rates of sexual and gender-based violence and the well-documented role of weapons in such violence. Arms embargoes are insufficiently respected and enforced. There is an urgent need for all arms and munitions exporters to implement their duty of due diligence by integrating a gender perspective, as stipulated in particular by the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management. This must include a risk assessment of the entire supply chain and can be complemented by collaboration with civil society organizations. Mr. President, it is our duty to do everything we can to reduce violence against women. The Women, Peace and Security agenda provides us with a clear framework based on 3 pillars: prevention, participation, and protection. Arms control and disarmament are a powerful lever for strengthening these pillars, and we must use it, and we can do this to ensure that violence and impunity end. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the representative of Switzerland and now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to express my sincere appreciations to Malta for hosting this debate. and SRSG Patten for her briefing, and particularly Ms. Ahmadi and Ms. Gurira for their touching testimonies. Mr. President, briefers just provided some related statistics on these critical issues, but let me begin by again emphasizing a particularly disheartening statistic. With escalating conflicts across the world, the estimates of conflict-related sexual violence for the last year alone exceed 3,600 cases. This represents a staggering 50% increase from the 2,455 cases reported in 2022 by the UN. Behind these numbers also lies the unimaginable suffering and trauma endured by victims and survivors. And yet, it is important to recognize that these figures are likely a significant underestimate, as many cases go unreported and unverified. In this sense, Korea welcomes Secretary General's report on CRSV, which has once again shed light on this critical issue. The report shows that as conflicts intensify, so does the tragic prevalence of conflict-related sexual violence. The attacks by Hamas against Israel citizens and the subsequent hostilities in Gaza resulted in enormous suffering on women, both in Israel and Gaza, including the heinous sexual violence against Israeli women described in the report by the SRSG Patten. Also, escalating violence and armed conflicts in DR Congo, Sudan, Haiti have exposed women to the most serious levels of gender-related violence, including sexual violence. We are profoundly concerned by the disproportionate impacts of conflicts on women and girls who endure the most brutal forms of violence. The proliferation and widespread availability of illicit small arms and light weapons only serves to facilitate the systematic occurrence of sexual violence in conflicts. Mr. President, against this background, I would like to highlight the following 3 points. First, each member here should fully implement and leverage the synergies among the international arms control treaties and frameworks to minimize the immediate risks of a CRSV that is enabled by the irresponsible transfer of the illicit trafficking of arms. In this sense, Korea calls on all member states to fully and effectively mainstream gender perspective in their arms control activities, in line with the international obligations, including the Arms Trade Treaty, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, and the recently adopted Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management, just to name a few. In particular, the ATT is the first legally binding multilateral instrument to recognize the link between gender-based violence and the international arms trade. As the president of the 9th Conference of States Parties last year, we have highlighted the importance of its universalization and effective implementation of the ATT. Korea will remain devoted in establishing responsible practices on arms transfers. Second, we should do our utmost to ensure women's full, equal, and meaningful and safe participation in leadership in disarmament and arms control fora. Women are undoubtedly the critical stakeholders. It is high time that words are translated into action and respond to the repeated calls for women's participation. It is upon our responsibility to ensure women's voices and perspectives are not left out throughout the decision-making processes at all levels of disarmament, and arms control, spanning national, regional, and international mechanisms. Lastly, beyond preventing CRSV and addressing its root causes, it is equally essential to provide comprehensive support to survivors of CRSV. As we heard today vividly from Ms. Ahmadi's testimonies, their stories of resilience, courage, and hope must not be relegated to the sidelines. By empowering them and helping them turn into active political agents, they can contribute to shaping laws, policies regarding arms control and disarmament by providing their insights in order to prevent recurrence of such incidents. Korea has started our own Action with Women and Peace initiative to support global efforts aimed at ending conflict-related sexual violence and enhancing women's participation in peace processes. For one, under this initiative, Korea has been supporting humanitarian and development projects to mitigate risks of gender-based violence in Africa, such as Sudan and Cameroon, in close cooperation with UNFPA. At the same time, we have been hosting annual conference on action with Women and Peace since 2019, fostering global discussions on WPS agendas, including conflict-related sexual violence. Additionally, we launched the Action with the Women and Peace Fund this year to support women activities, peace builders, and humanitarian workers playing crucial roles in preventing and addressing CRSV. In closing, advancing gender-responsive arms control and disarmament measures, along with fully incorporating gender dimension in relevant discussions, is a crucial part of our collective efforts to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. Korea remains steadfast in our commitment to this cause and stands ready to actively participate and collaborate with all of you. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea and now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Malta for convening this open debate. We thank the briefers, Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Ms. Niemat Ahmadi, Founder and President of Darfur Women Action Group, and Ms. Danai Gurira, UN Women Goodwill Ambassador, for their comprehensive briefings and for their courageous efforts to drive forward much-needed global action to tackle conflict-related sexual violence. Having experienced firsthand the devastating impact of conflict-related sexual violence on people and communities, Sierra Leone remains committed to joining proactive efforts to prevent conflict-related sexual violence through demilitarization and gender-responsive arms control. The prevalence of sexual violence relating to both conflict and peacetime situations is alarming. In ongoing conflicts, there are harrowing reported accounts of women, men, girls, and boys of disparate ages being deliberately targeted and victimized sexually. Bringing this historically hidden crime to the forefront of our discussions is the only way to address it. Sierra Leone notes with appreciation the important report of the Secretary General, which outlines progress made and emerging issues on sexual violence in conflict-affected areas for the reporting period, as well as forward-looking recommendations aimed at strengthening mechanisms for compliance of state and non-state actors with Security Council resolutions on this critical issue. We have taken note with grave concern the listings in the Annex of Parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of rape or other forms of sexual violence in situations of armed conflict that are on the agenda of the UN Security Council. In particular, we note with regret that Sudanese women are experiencing the impact of the escalating conflicts acutely and face a range of risks: kidnapping, rape, sexual exploitation, and forced marriage. We call upon all member states to stop arms transfers when there's a substantial risk that they may be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of violence against women and children in Sudan and in all conflict situations. We have the responsibility to ensure compliance with Resolution 2724 we reiterate the need for an immediate cessation of hostilities in Sudan and call on parties to respect international humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, the burden on women and girls warrants particular emphasis. Of the 3,688 verified cases of CRSV across 21 plus situations highlighted in the current report, 95% are women and girls. In conflict situations, the bodies of predominantly women and girls have become battlegrounds, not because of bombs and shells, but because of the heartless human hands and minds of armed groups, of state actors and non-state actors, who continue to take advantage of the anarchy of wars to inflict violence on the most vulnerable members of our communities. Women are being disempowered, raped, tortured, abducted, and humiliated, and many are ostracized at the end of conflicts because they bear the effects of the abuse, including through pregnancy. Increased militarization and proliferation of weapons, particularly small arms and light weapons, fuel the systematic and widespread occurrence of sexual violence in conflict. Weapons and ammunition are used by perpetrators to commit rape, to threaten and force individuals into sexual acts against their will, and to injure and kill survivors and victims of sexual violence. As stated in the concept note for this debate, a study by the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research across 6 countries in 2021 approximates that 70 to 90% of sexual violence incidents were reported to involve weapons, particularly firearms. Therefore, the role of arms control and disarmament in CRSV prevention is very critical. In this regard, there is also need to strengthen information sharing platforms where member states can share information, best practices, lessons learned, and emerging threats related to CRSV and the role of arms. This, we believe, will foster collaboration and allow countries to learn from each other's experiences. Mr. President, Sierra Leone believes there is light at the end of the tunnel because evidence does bear witness to the fact that rigorous enforcement of appropriate legal and regulatory frameworks do reduce incidences of CRSV. Our commitment to addressing this issue, for instance, is informed by experience, including the development of critical jurisprudence in the Special Court for Sierra Leone. The Special Court for Sierra Leone was the first international tribunal to recognize the new crime against humanity of forced marriage as an other inhumane act. In the post-conflict recovery and peace-building phase, Sierra Leone continues to demonstrate significant commitments to addressing CRSV and sexual and gender-based violence, including through the declaration of a national public emergency on rape in 2019. Sierra Leone continues to prioritize the prosecution of perpetrators, ensuring accountability while also recognizing the distinct harm inflicted on victims and the need for redress. In this regard, we wish to recall the importance of UN Security Council Resolution 2467. In view of the foregoing, Sierra Leone would like to reiterate the following 3 points. Firstly, we emphasize the need for state and non-state actors engaged in conflict to comply with their obligations under international law protecting civilians from CRSV. Secondly, we call on all member states and partners to strengthen networks for collaboration and cooperation for arms control and disarmament instruments and treaties, including the Arms Trade Treaty and the UN Program of Action to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in all its aspects. In this regard, we believe that states and other partners should advocate for stronger accountability mechanisms, including judicial action, against those who are proven to have committed acts of conflict-related sexual violence, as well as the establishment of reparation mechanisms for victims. Global, regional, and national mechanisms for arms control and disarmament should seek the active participation and views of survivors of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, as key stakeholders. Similarly, gender analysis and gender-responsive monitoring should be incorporated into these mechanisms to effectively address the gendered impacts of the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. Thirdly and finally, we must improve our efforts to address systemic gender inequality, which can be a causal factor for conflict-related violence, particularly against women and girls. In this regard, the achievement of targets related to gender equality, justice, and strong institutions in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and particularly SDGs 5 and 16, of critical importance. Addressing the underlying historical, political, cultural, social, and economic factors of conflicts are also key to tackling CRSV. In closing, Sierra Leone reiterates its commitment to the protection of vulnerable populations and inclusive efforts to combat CRSV. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone, and now I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I sincerely thank Malta for convening this important meeting. I also thank SRSG Patten, Ms. Ahmadi, and Ambassador Gurira for their comprehensive briefings and their strenuous efforts to raise our awareness on this critically pressing and important issue. Sexual violence in conflict is a serious crime that violates entire human dignity and must never be tolerated, no matter where in the world. Japan is deeply concerned and alarmed by findings that in the latest Secretary General's report, pointing out heightened levels of conflict-related sexual violence fueled by arms proliferation and increased militarization. As the Secretary General's report recommends, we must improve prevention of CRSV by incorporating this agenda in arms control and disarmament frameworks and cross-leveraging related UN mechanisms and tools. Japan has been a state party to the Arms Trade Treaty, ATT, since it came into force in 2014. The treaty requires state parties to assess the risk that arms exports could be used to commit serious acts of gender-based violence. Japan has prioritized universalization of this treaty and reiterates its call for non-state parties to join the ATT. To reduce the risk that arms transfers and illicit weapons are used to commit CRSV, we should strengthen international cooperation through frameworks such as Division Information Exchange Forum, a body of the ATT, where information on transfers of illicit weapons is exchanged. Further, we should promote implementation of the UN Program of Action to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in all its aspects. Mr. President, to promote international cooperation in this field, Japan has contributed $2 million to Salient, the Saving Lives entity, a UN initiative launched in 2020 that supports member states in tackling armed violence and illicit small arms and light weapons. In its project to curtail small arms, as much as 30% of the budget is allocated to the gender-related activities, including prevention of gender-based violence. Japan hopes Salient will continue to contribute to reducing gender-based violence related to the proliferation of illicit small arms and light weapons. Mr. President, we should also ensure women's participation in the area of arms control and disarmament to adequately address CRSV. Every year, together with Colombia and South Africa, Japan submits the General Assembly resolution on illicit trade in small arms and light weapons. This resolution emphasizes the need for equal, full, and effective participation of women in all decision-making and implementation processes related to Program of Action and the International Tracing Instrument. I invite all member states to support and fully implement this resolution. At the national level, in Japan's third National Action Plan on WPS, Japan is explicitly committed to promoting women's participation and incorporating a gender perspective in developing and conducting small arms and light weapons countermeasures and other disarmament and non-proliferation efforts. In conclusion, Japan reaffirms its commitment to prevention of CRSV through demilitarization, arms control, and disarmament, building on today's discussions. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I welcome you to New York as you preside over this debate. I thank SRSG Patten and other briefers for their briefings. Women are one of the most vulnerable groups. Their rights and interests are most easily violated. They are most in need of protection. China firmly opposes the use of sexual violence as a means of war and terrorism, strongly condemns all sexual violence against women and girls, and calls on the international community to adopt a comprehensive approach as a response. I wish to emphasize the following points. First, we must resolutely combat all forms of sexual violence. Without effective punishments for criminal acts, it will be difficult to deter and prevent new violations. All countries should strengthen the rule of law, punish perpetrators of violence with zero tolerance in accordance with the law, and seek justice for the victims. Recently, Haiti has seen a surge in gun violence, resulting in horrific incidents of sexual violence, which pose a serious threat to local women and girls and generate fear among the population. China calls upon all parties to support the efforts by the Haitian police in maintaining law and order, strictly implement the arms embargo, shut down at the source the channels through which the guns illegally obtain weapons and ammunition, and stabilize the situation on the ground as soon as possible. Secondly, we need to make every effort to suppress terrorist activities. In recent years, the problems of kidnapping, human trafficking, and sexual violence committed by terrorist groups in West Africa, the Middle East, and other regions has become increasingly pronounced. Many of the actors listed in the SG's report as suspects of committing sexual violence are terrorist groups listed by the Security Council. It is incumbent upon all parties to abide by the purpose and the principles of the UN Charter, respect the sovereignty, independence, and the territorial integrity of the countries concerned, give full play the leading role of the UN and its Security Council, put an end to double standards in fighting terrorism, strengthen international counterterrorism cooperation, and resolutely combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Thirdly, we should promote comprehensive development of women. The issue of sexual violence does not arise out of thin air. Rather, it is closely related to the issue of development. The international community should focus on the long term, scale up assistance to developing countries, accelerate the implementation of the SDGs, strengthen women's empowerment, and promote gender equality. It is important to pay attention to the special needs of victims of sexual violence, provide timely, urgent medical care and psychological counseling services, and help them heal the trauma and reintegrate into society at an early date. China welcomes the enactment of laws and adoption action plans for the protection of women and children in Sri Lanka, Somalia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. President, the ultimate goal of CRSV agenda is not just to make the conflict free of sexual violence. The ultimate goal is to make the world free of war. The most fundamental way to address CRSV is to stop and prevent war itself. As we speak, the conflict in the Gaza Strip has lasted some 6 months now, where more than 10,000 women have been killed. More than 1 million Palestinian women and girls are facing starvation. This man-made humanitarian disaster must end. It is imperative to promote a full and effective implementation of Council Resolution 2728 to achieve an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and stop all actions that harm civilians. China has taken note of the report issued by SRSG Patten following her visit in February this year to Israel upon invitation, during which she also traveled to the occupied West Bank. It is our hope that the relevant parties will take recommendations contained in the report seriously and respond positively. China stands ready to continue to work with the international community to create an environment of peace, security, and stability around the world, and make a positive contribution to the early eradication of CRSV and the advancement of the WPS agenda. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement and give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to express my gratitude to the Maltese presidency for its wise selection of today's discussion topic on conflict-related sexual violence. I would also like to thank briefers for their insightful briefings. Mr. President, despite 24 years having passed since this Council adopted Resolution 1325, recognizing the vital role of women, particularly in conflict prevention and mitigation, we continue to witness an unacceptable delay in implementing its provisions. In this context, and in affirmation of the remarks made by the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, during his participation in the general debate of the current session of the General Assembly, my country adopted a national action plan in July 2023 with the aim of achieving the objectives of this UN resolution. This plan, developed in collaboration with various national bodies and relevant stakeholders, primarily aims to encourage women's engagement in the security and military sectors, to raise awareness of their importance, to enhance women's presence in various national, regional, and international bodies, to recruit more women into security and military ranks, and to support women's access and promotion to leadership positions in security agencies. Mr. President, Algeria values its achievements in enhancing the status of women and promoting gender equality, particularly in surpassing quota systems and replacing them with a balanced representation system of 50-50. This progressive step reflects our commitment to building an inclusive and just society where women have equal opportunities to contribute to all aspects of political, economic, and developmental life. This has been reflected in significant strides in the presence and representation of women, where Algerian women's participation in the judiciary sector has exceeded 54%, while they account for over 68% in the higher education sector and 45% in scientific research. As for the health sector, women represent more than 50%. In the military and security sectors, the work is tremendously in progress to match the attained objectives in the high-ranking category. These impressive statistics reflect the effectiveness of the government's plan and vision to empower women and enhance their participation in Algerian society. Mr. President, in my statement today regarding this very timely issue, I will shed light on two situations. Women and girls are paying a heavy toll of the crisis in Sudan, which erupted a year ago, being subject to serious violations. It is, therefore, imperative to urgently cease all forms of sexual and gender-based violence and encourage the setting of the required justice and healing mechanisms. It is also essential to ensure women's meaningful participation in peace efforts to ensure the required inclusiveness of any peace process. In the same context, Mr. President, Algeria draws attention to the dire situation of Palestinian women who endure immense suffering and violations of their fundamental rights, including the right to life, in a brutal and ongoing manner, especially over the past 6 months. Since October 7th, reports indicate that Palestinian women and girls in detention have been subjected to multiple forms of sexual violence and assault. According to UN human rights mandate holders and experts, Palestinian women and children in areas where they seek refuge or while fleeing are also targets of deliberate attacks and extrajudicial killings by Israeli occupation forces. Such violations must be rigorously investigated and perpetrators held accountable. Zero impunity for these crimes must be the guiding principle. The suffering of Palestinian women serves as a tragic reminder of the urgent need to immediately stop all forms of conflict-related sexual violence, as stated in Recommendation A of this month's report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for her statement and now invite the representative of the Russian Federation to take the floor.
Mr.
President, we listened to today's briefers. Mr. President, we believe linking the topic of preventing sexual violence and conflict with demilitarization and arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation under the Women, Peace and Security Agenda Item WPS to be artificial, diverting attention from truly important problems which do exist across both areas. The Russian Federation condemns sexual violence in all its forms, just as we condemn any other crimes committed in armed conflict and in post-conflict situations. Such deeds should be investigated and their perpetrators should be held to account. This is law enforcement activity which falls within the purview of states. Measures taken by UN system bodies and by civil society simply add to these state efforts. And yet, we're compelled to recognize that the UN's contribution on this front is significantly restricted by the fact that the post of the SRSG on sexual violence and conflict is occupied by Ms. Pramila Patten. Ms. Patten has turned this important mandate into a source for political statements, outright lies, and manipulation. This is unacceptable. A clear example of such politicization is the Secretary General's reports section, the report on sexual violence and conflict, the section on Ukraine. To begin, we'd like to note that this section of the report has no added value. It simply reprints information from the so-called monitoring mission in Ukraine of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This mission, as we all know, is fully controlled by Kiev, meaning its data cannot be characterized as objective. But even this mission reflected some crimes committed by Ukrainian militants: beatings, electric shock torture, rape, and threats of rape against those suspected of cooperating with the authorities in Donetsk and Lugansk. This information didn't make it into Ms. Patten's report, however. Any allegations leveled against states or parties to a conflict in the report should be reliable, based on fact-checked information and taken from verifiable sources. And yet, the SRSG prefers to include groundless allegations against armed forces without going to the trouble of verifying such information. Last year, before the report was published, the Russian Federation officially requested for the SG to provide information that could be used to conduct verifications. These requests were ignored. This year, the SRSG didn't even submit the relevant portion of the report to the Russian Federation for comment. It has become patently obvious that her goals do not include the prevention of sexual violence. All she intends to do is to apportion political labels. Therefore, we would like to underscore that we fully repudiate the insinuations contained in the report. Russian servicemen's actions in combat and non-combat situations are subject to a unified command. to strict rules and regulations. Any unlawful actions are investigated without delay, and the guilty are taken to court. Other sections of the report are similarly unbalanced. Specifically, the section on Myanmar. Once again, it's one-sided and politicized. The list of wrongdoers mainly includes the Myanmar Armed Forces. Meanwhile, the crimes being committed by terrorists and militants are ignored. This does nothing to help the report's objectivity. Mr. President, the Russian Federation deems arms control and control over military use equipment, including control over small arms and light weapons, salve, to be a pillar of our efforts to uphold international peace and security, especially in the context of the fight against terrorism. It's important for decision makers on international security and arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation, as well as others involved in the aforementioned spheres, for them to be judged on the basis of their abilities, merits and achievements, irrespective of their sex. The Women, Peace and Security WPS agenda shouldn't be mechanically, automatically included in off-topic UN documents, including those on arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation. On our side, we don't see how discussions about gender-responsive arms control can help resolve real problems which many states are confronted with. That is the fact that terrorists and criminal groups have growing access to salve. And in fact, salve exceeds every other arms category in terms of the number of victims. This problem is covered in the SG's report on the threat posed by ISIS. And yet, those same reports omit to mention where the terrorists get their weapons from. The Security Council should not turn a blind eye to the fact that terrorists get their weapons either from criminal groups or directly from those who supply such weapons across the world in large quantities. The US and NATO abandoned weapons and machinery in Afghanistan. It's now being used by terrorists, including ISIS, both in South Asia and in Afghanistan itself. Weapons which Western states are sending to the regime in Kiev is cropping up in the hands of criminal groups in Europe and in the arms of terrorists in Africa. Right now, the US government is working on disbursing $23 billion to Ukraine and $26 billion to Israel so that they can increase their stocks of US weapons. These very same weapons will serve as fertile soil for terrorists and criminals the world over. It will claim the lives of thousands of women and children. Some time ago, the Russian Federation initiated here at the Security Council efforts to enhance existing standards applicable to the fight against supplies of arms to terrorists. Back in 2017, with our active support, UN Security Council Resolution 2370 was adopted. We promoted this topic also being included in Security Council Resolution 2462 on combating terrorist financing and Security Council Resolution 2482 on the terrorist organized crime nexus. In Moscow in 2018 and 2019, a number of major international conferences on this topic were convened. And yet the situation hasn't improved since then, because the implementation of the measures the Council has developed is only possible when we have depoliticized interstate cooperation, with the UN playing a coordinating central role, something that's currently lacking. The Russian Federation supports buttressing cooperation and coordination between relevant UN Secretariat bodies and regional organizations. At the Russian Federation's behest, a dedicated technical cooperation program has been launched under the auspices of the UN Office of Counterterrorism and UNODC, the objective being to build capacity in Central Asia in the sphere of combating the illicit arms trade, including the prevention of such arms falling into the hands of terrorists. The next phase of this project plans to provide similar assistance to states in Africa. President, the current state of play is a clear illustration of the importance of controlling conventional arms and military use goods, including salve. We cannot but recognize that despite the steps that are being taken, women continue to fall victim to different forms of violence. They're dying, they're being injured in armed conflicts. We must find ways of resolving this problem in the areas under our consideration, without politicization, without double standards, and without artificially linking sexual violence to arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start by thanking Malta for organizing this important debate. I also want to thank SRSG Patten and her team for their comprehensive briefing and report. I commend her efforts, including on Ukraine, for which my Russian colleague thought he should target his statement attacking her. I also want to thank Ms. Gurira, the UN Goodwill Ambassador, for her powerful statement and for joining us here today. And I thank you for your efforts on this issue. Colleagues, this month marks 10 years since the Chibok kidnappings in Nigeria. I remember this day so well as I was the Assistant Secretary for Africa for the United States, and I remember the outrage. It's been 10 years since Boko Haram ripped over 270 schoolgirls from their dormitories and forced them into a life of sexual slavery and domestic servitude, ripping them away from their families and their lives and their futures. A third of these girls remain missing to this day. I wish I could say this horrific kidnapping marked a turning point, that it was the last of this kind of violence against women and girls. But as this year's report lays bare, we're still experiencing a global crisis of conflict-related sexual violence. And in country after country, impunity for it remains the norm. From Nigeria to Israel, Myanmar to Sudan, Haiti to the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have seen terrorist groups, criminal gangs, and non-state armed groups abducting and sexually exploiting women and girls. We've seen rape being used as a tool of war. And I'll note that the report calls for the release of the nearly 3,000 Yazidis who are still missing, as well as hostages kidnapped by Hamas and other terrorist groups from Israel on October 7th. We know from UN reporting that many of these hostages have experienced sexual violence while in captivity. There is so much work to be done to combat this epidemic of violence, to address both its impacts and its root causes, and most importantly, help survivors heal. But for today, I want to focus on 3 core actions before us as detailed in this report. The first action is holding perpetrators of CRSV accountable. The United States agrees with the SRSG's conclusion that the international community must assist national authorities in strengthening rule of law institutions and building forensic capacity so that investigators can properly gather the evidence needed to indict and convict those who perpetrate CRSV. To that end, I want to commend the work being done by the team of experts to conduct training and provide legal and forensic capacity building assistance to national governments. And I want to acknowledge the efforts in Sierra Leone and align with her statement recommending stronger accountability mechanisms. And the United States has undertaken this critical work too. In Haiti, for example, under the U.S. strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability in Haiti, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs and USAID are working in partnership to support the Haitian National Police, helping them build trust with the communities they serve, and training officers to mitigate, respond to, and investigate GBV cases. In Ukraine, the United States is also supporting the efforts of the Office of the Prosecutor General to document, investigate, and prosecute war crimes, including those involving CRSV committed by Russian forces. But this work takes all of us. Nearly 1 in 3 women have been or will be subject to sexual violence in their lifetime. 1 in 3. The sheer magnitude of this crisis impels UN member states to work together and with the team of experts to share best practices and coordinate collective resources. More than just addressing CRSV after it happens, we must prevent it, period. And that brings me to my second point, addressing the systemic challenges that enable, facilitate, and exacerbate CRSV, including especially the proliferation of small and light weapons. As the report notes, somewhere between 70 and 90% of incidents of CRSV in Myanmar, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and South Sudan involve small arms and light weapons. Indeed, the illicit proliferation and widespread availability of these weapons and their ammunition directly facilitated these incidents. What's more, sexual violence continues to play a significant role in the political economy of war. Women and girls are trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. They are kidnapped with the threat and use of sexual violence to extort higher ransoms. We see this in Haiti, where the illicit weapons trade is fueling the gang's strategic use of sexual violence. It's why the United States will continue to work closely with our partners at the UN and in Kenya to establish systems and processes within the MSS mission to Haiti to, among other things, prevent arms smuggling. It is why we will continue to uphold the U.S. conventional arms transfer policy, which directs our government agencies to assess whether U.S. arms transfers may be used to commit, facilitate, or increase the risk of gender-based violence. And it's why we will continue to work with the UN sanctions committees to designate individuals who are responsible for human rights abuses, including CRSV. My third and final point is that in all of this work, we must ensure that our approach, from mitigation to documentation, monitoring to prosecution, is survivor-centered, consent-based, and linked to gender-based violence response services. This report has underscored the importance of this approach, highlighting governments that are actively addressing CRSV and empowering women to lead. Places like Colombia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, Iraq, and the Central African Republic are showing the world how centering survivors can heal communities. And for our part, the United States is supporting other states in doing the same, from helping Ukrainian institutions provide survivors with psychosocial support, reintegration services, and a survivor-centered approach to legal assistance, to funding counseling services that help empower survivors and providers in South Sudan, to working with local NGOs in India to map legal and social support for vulnerable women at risk of GBV, including enabling Rohingya women who are at heightened risk for this violence to leave abusive relationships, access survivor services, and secure protection from local police. Colleagues, 10 years since that terrible day in Nigeria, there is still so much work to be done to hold accountable non-state actors who are terrorizing women and girls with impunity, to ensure state forces do not commit sexual violence. So let us seek justice for survivors, give them the support needed to heal themselves and their communities. Let us center survivors in our efforts, both here at the United Nations and as individual member states. Let us work to combat the drivers of CRSV, including the transfer of small and light weapons. And let us end this culture of impunity that has allowed gender-based violence to take hold for far, far too long. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for a statement and now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, through you, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, Mozambique commends Malta for organizing this important open debate. We extend our deep appreciation to Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict, to Ms. Danai, Gurira, UN Women Goodwill Ambassador, and to Ms. Niemat Ahmadi, founder and president of Darfur Women Action Group, for their comprehensive and insightful briefings. Mr. President, conflict-related violence is a grave and corrosive human rights violation, and it disproportionately affects women and girls. As pointed out in the Secretary General's latest report, these heinous crimes have regrettably intensified following and in the context of the outbreak and escalation of conflicts last year. They are having a devastating impact on individual human lives, in communities, and societies as a whole. Mozambique expresses our strong condemnation of the use of sexual violence. We defend that the perpetrators must be held accountable. We acknowledge that conflict-related sexual violence has been fueled by several factors, including arms proliferation and increased militarization. This unfortunate reality compels us to reflect on gender perspectives and the impact of arms control on vulnerable women, as well as gender dynamics in the design, implementation, and monitoring of arms control initiatives and policies. Our experience in Mozambique shows that women's participation in disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR, can contribute to the delivery of justice to the victims of CRSV and to the building of peace in the country. In addition, we came to realize that initiatives seeking to address conflict-related sexual violence must encourage women's participation in peace processes and decision-making, address the root causes of conflicts, and enhance a judicial system to prevent and be responsive to situations of sexual violence. Mr. President, international and regional initiatives are of paramount importance in addressing and preventing conflict-related sexual violence as well as arms control. This allows for coordinated actions by countries in different regions. We hold the view that ending conflict-related sexual violence is a crucial component towards achieving sustainable peace and security, particularly in our continent, Africa. In this regard, we highlight the Africa Amnesty Month for the surrender and collection of illicit arms and light weapons as a commendable effort to control arms and weapons. This is a measure that has been in place since 2017 under the African Union Silencing the Guns initiative. This contributes to reducing the availability of weapons and therefore making them less accessible to perpetrators of CRSV. The African continent counts on a framework aimed at preventing the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, as well as CRSV, including the Arms Trade Treaty, African Union's campaign on preventing and responding to SRSV of 2019, and the African Union's network on gender and peace building of 2018. These initiatives aim to raise awareness, build capacity, and promote coordination on arms control and cooperation to prevent and respond to CRSV and promote sustainable peace and security in our continent. Mr. President, in the context of our own national DDR, Mozambique has made enormous efforts in preventing CRSV. Additionally, the country's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security includes a component to prevent and respond effectively to CRSV. While progress has been made, we think that more needs to be done to address the root causes of CRSV, ensure sustained support for survivors, and promote gender equality. In this context, Mozambique wishes to reiterate our firm commitment to continue contributing to our collective action in addressing conflict-related sexual violence, including through arms and weapons controls. It is our conviction that women and girls can play a transformative role in political, socio-economic, and peace processes that must be capitalized for the purposes of peace, security, and stability in the world. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement and now ask the representative of the United Kingdom to take the floor.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank SR Patten, Ms. Ahmadi and Ms. Gurira for briefing us today. And I'd particularly like to thank SRSG Patten for her commitment to speaking out on behalf of victims and survivors and for upholding and delivering on her mandate. Thank you. President, CRSV is not an inevitable consequence of war. The UK remains committed to tackling CRSV. Indeed, we have prioritised this agenda through the leadership of our Prime Minister's Special Representative, and we've contributed through key initiatives, including the launch of the Murad Code. I'd like to outline 3 priorities. First, on the focus of today's debate, UNIDIA estimates that 70 to 90% of CRSV incidents involve weapons and firearms. In contexts where widely available small arms and weapons are contributing to high rates of CRSV, effective conventional arms control can play a vital role in prevention. and women should be at the centre of these efforts. Our own WPS National Action Plan highlights the importance of arms control. We call for the implementation of national arms control measures, including effective export controls, to strengthen CRSV prevention. Gender-responsive security sector reform will help ensure those who bear arms do not use them to perpetrate CRSV. The fact that CRSV is so widespread, as shown in the Secretary-General's annual report, is truly shocking. This Council has an essential role to play in shaping the international response to CRSV. We should use the tools the Security Council has to deter future CRSV, including through sanctions where appropriate. Second, President, there are three contexts I would like to draw particular attention to. First, in Sudan, as Ms. Ahmadi's moving briefing brought home to us so clearly, reports of CRSV paint a dire picture, and the UK is supporting partners to care for and protect survivors. We echo the Secretary-General's call for the cessation of violence, an immediate and sustainable ceasefire, and for humanitarian corridors so that survivors can access support. The second context is Ukraine. There is evidence of CRSV, and it is mounting evidence of CRSV committed by Russian forces against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. 2 Russian perpetrators have been convicted for CRSV. These acts appear to show a pattern where CRSV is being used as a weapon of war. And the UK PSVI team of experts is helping to build investigatory capacity to support accountability in Ukraine. The third context, in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, we condemn all allegations and reports of CRSV. We call for thorough investigations and a survivor-centred approach, and for hostages to be released immediately, and for detainees to be treated with dignity and in line with humanitarian international law. Finally, President, in a world where, as we heard from Ms. Gurira, 80 cents is all it takes to destroy a girl's life, the UK continues to drive action to strengthen the global response to CRSV, having established last year the International Alliance on PSVI. 26 members have joined, including governments, multilaterals, survivors, and civil society organisations, including the ICC, and we continue to welcome new members. Through the Alliance, we are driving forward stronger international coordination to address CRSV and provide support to survivors. So we call for Council members to implement the recommendations of this report, to play their part to end these abhorrent acts and to end impunity for them once and for all. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Premier Ministre.
Prime Minister, at the outset, I should like to thank the Maltese presidency for convening this open debate. We'd also like to thank the briefers for their moving witness accounts and briefings. I'd like to recall France's unswerving support to the SRSG's mandate and her team of experts who are marking their 15th anniversary. As the Secretary-General's annual report shows, sexual violence is on the rise, disproportionately affecting women and girls in Sudan, which is going through one of the most serious humanitarian crises on our planet, in South Sudan, in Haiti, in the CAR, in the DRC, and in many other conflict situations. France highlights the fact that the annual report now includes a section on Gaza and the West Bank. We reiterate our condemnation in the strongest possible terms of terrorist attacks and the sexual violence committed by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October last year. We condemn, also in the strongest possible terms, the use of rape as a weapon of war, wherever this is used. It is important for the annual report to shed light on sexual violence being used, including by the Russian Federation in the conflict against Ukraine, including rape. President, the report underscores salve trafficking and their spread, which salve is what's used in the overwhelming majority of CRSV cases. We call states to unswervingly uphold their international obligations in this respect, especially their arms trade treaty obligation when considering export requests. What should be taken into account is the risk of these weapons being used to commit gender-based violence or facilitate such violence being committed. We call for the full implementation of SCR 2616 and 2220 on record-keeping and traceability of salve, as well as disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration processes. The review conference for the Programme of Action on Salve, the 4th RevCon, will take place in June of this year. It will be an important milestone. President, this Council must continue taking concrete action to implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda in all of its dimensions. On this note, we'd like to thank UN Women, the UN Population Fund, the Department DPO, and the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, DPPA, for all of the measures they're undertaking. We must take action, first of all, by combating impunity, as Ms. Gurira entreated us to do. We need to ensure that national legislation punishes sexual crimes and that victims are brought to do get justice. We welcome the key work done by the team of experts of the SRSG. Recently, they organized the first international conference of prosecutors on CRSV. This event was co-convened by France. We welcome the efforts of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to investigate this kind of violence. We must also take action by supporting victim survivors. We must ensure they have access to basic health services, including sexual and reproductive health services. I'd like to recall that within the framework of its 3rd National Plan of Action on WPS 2021-2025, France has contributed 14.2 million euros to the Global CRSV Survivors Fund. We must also work together to collectively address the issue of children born of conflict-related rape. Last but not least, we should act by sanctioning the perpetrators of CRSV. In particular, we're in favor of bolstering the expertise of Sanctions Committee panels of experts, to do more to take into account the annex of the SG's report in the work of these committees and these panels. We should consider including a sexual violence-related listing criteria in sanctions regimes which don't yet have one, whenever this is pertinent. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of France for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, I thank SRSG Pramila Patten, UN Goodwill Ambassador Ms. Danai, Gurira, and Ms. Niemat, Ahmadi for their briefings. The recent report of the Secretary-General on conflict-related sexual violence has again highlighted that the illicit flow and widespread availability of small arms and light weapons and their ammunition are directly facilitating incidents of conflict-related sexual violence and fostering an environment conducive to the perpetration of such violence. CRSV continues to be used by state and non-state actors as a tactic of war, a tool of torture, and a means of asserting power and dominance with devastating consequences for victims and survivors, their families, and communities. While women and girls are the vast majority of those affected by conflict-related sexual violence, they continue to be excluded from key decision-making on matters of peace and security. Guyana underscores the importance of women's full, equal, and meaningful participation, including in decision-making at all levels of political and peace-building processes, as well as in disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control efforts. The Security Council and regional organizations must intensify efforts in cross-leveraging disarmament frameworks with UN mechanisms and tools, particularly in the lead-up to the 4th Review Conference of the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons. Integration of gender perspectives in disarmament discussions can significantly bolster conflict-related sexual violence prevention, ensuring that the solutions are both comprehensive and effective. The Security Council must utilize all of the tools at its disposal to address CRSV. Mandate authorizations and renewals of peace operations should include operational provisions as well as arms control and disarmament measures aimed at preventing and responding to sexual violence. While there is accelerated drawdown of some peace operations, it is necessary to sustain monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements and engagement with parties on conflict-related sexual violence. In this regard, we recognize the critical contribution of women's protection advisors. We also emphasize the indispensability of sustaining investments in disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, and in security sector reform during transitions and mission drawdowns. Maintaining these investments is crucial for the protection of civilians from CRSV and for preventing its reoccurrence. Continuous support and capacity building for national and local institutions are vital in ensuring that gains are not transient, but that there is a firm foundation for development, equality, and accountability, factors that are critical to prevention and deterrence of sexual violence. To mitigate the risks that arms transfers and illicit weapon proliferation pose to CRSV, robust international cooperation and adherence to the Arms Trade Treaty are necessary. State parties must comply with their obligations under the treaty to comprehensively assess the potential risks of whether arms could be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence prior to authorizing the export of arms. Effective risk assessment under the treaty will require systematic data collection and disaggregation. It is also crucial to combat impunity and its emboldening effect on perpetrators by promoting accountability. Sexual violence crimes must be excluded from amnesty and immunity provisions. The Council must continue to insist that state and non-state parties to conflicts adopt time-bound commitments to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence and for compliance with these commitments to be monitored. There is also a need to strengthen linkages between the parties listed in the Secretary General's annual reports on conflict-related sexual violence and sanctions designations. Guyana believes that sexual and gender-based violence should be a standalone designation criteria for applying sanctions to persistent perpetrators. In closing, Mr. President, Guyana reaffirms its commitments to the WPS agenda and to eliminating conflict-related sexual violence through concerted demilitarization and gender-responsive arms control measures. It is only through collective action, sustained investment, promotion of gender equality, and by ensuring justice and support for survivors, as well as the full integration of women in all decision-making processes, that we can eradicate the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am grateful for the information provided by Special Representative Pramila Patten, by the Goodwill Ambassador, Ms. Danai Gurira, and by the representative from civil society, Ms. Niemat Ahmadi. Ecuador takes note of the content of the Secretary General's report on CRSV in 2023, and we regret that the global escalation of conflict-related violence continues to undermine conditions of security and dignity for the civilian population, in particular for women, girls, and persons with diverse gender identities. The report documents verified cases of the use of sexual violence as a war tactic, forced marriages, unwanted pregnancies, and it establishes a link between the persistence with which these crimes are committed and the worsening of armed conflicts. Further, it recognizes that displaced, refugee, and migrant women represent one of the most vulnerable groups and one of the groups at greatest risk of falling victim to trafficking networks for sexual exploitation. At the same time, there is a growing trend in the number of women facing gender-based, politically motivated attacks, violent attacks, misinformation and dissemination of hate speech, on and offline bullying as strategies to discredit them in the political sphere and to intimidate human rights defenders and restrict and limit their possibilities of participating in the public sphere. Mr. President, one of the elements most discussed during the open debate on small arms and light weapons organized by my country in December 2023 was that the majority of violent incidents related to the use of weapons are carried out by men, and the misuse of these weapons increases the incidence of CRSV and impunity, and therefore more women must participate in the peace process and in the decision-making process on arms control. Moreover, having UN-verified information on the number of cases of CRSV as well as the list of possible perpetrators is relevant in efforts to halt this despicable practice, and it is a decisive factor in eradicating impunity by establishing transparent, victim-centered accountability and reparative justice systems pursuant to the provisions of Security Council Resolution 2467. My delegation believes that it is essential to promote joint work between the United Nations, regional bodies, and national institutions to ensure that teams on the ground have conditions of security and freedom of movement in the most complex areas so that they can continue to compile statistics and give a voice to victims, and that these statistics will guide the decision-making process in this Council and in the international community. Along these lines, I would recognize the work carried out by the interinstitutional network UN Action Against CRSV, which gives account of the effectiveness of coordinated management of financing to build institutional capacity and to implement programs and projects for the prevention of sexual violence at the local level, but with a regional and global perspective. Ecuador believes it is essential to strengthen actions aimed at designing preventive CRSV frameworks to address the root causes of these conflicts and to use political and diplomatic tools to achieve definitive agreements, ceasefire agreements, and to ensure the empowerment of victims and their full and safe participation in the peace-building and peacekeeping process pursuant to the provisions of Resolution 1325 and other related resolutions. Mr. President, I will conclude my statement by underscoring the commitment of the informal group of experts on women, peace, and security of this Council. The systematic work that that group is doing under the leadership of Switzerland in Sierra Leone, with the support of UN Women, must continue in order to shed light on the specific challenges in each of the conflict situations, to encourage the inclusion of perpetrators on sanctions lists, and to ensure that the output of this Council includes clear-cut provisions on how to address CRSV. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now ask the representative of Slovenia to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Sexual and gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, is on the rise globally. It continues to be used as a tactic of war. This not only constitutes a serious violation of international law and may amount to a war crime or a crime against humanity, it is also one of the most heinous crimes and must be stopped. We welcome this year's focus of the open debate on preventing conflict-related sexual violence through demilitarization and gender-responsive arms control. We are appalled by the findings of the recent Secretary General's report, as just presented by Special Representative Patten, and we are thankful to Mrs. Ahmadi and Gurira for their remarks and for their dedication. Mr. President, the availability of arms, particularly small arms and light weapons, and their ammunition, significantly affects lives of women and girls. It has been mentioned today already, but let me repeat that between 70 to 90% of incidents of conflict-related sexual violence involve small arms and light weapons. Their illicit transfer, misuse, and in particular the ease to obtain them, continue to fuel armed conflict, violence, acts of crime, and terrorism. We see it in several situations on the agenda of the Council, including DRC, Myanmar, Sudan, and Haiti. We strongly condemn all acts of sexual violence in all settings, including in Israel and Palestine, and call for their investigation. To address this, we must intensify our joint efforts. Let me make the following observations. First, states must strengthen national authorities, legislation, regulations, and administrative procedures on control and transfer of small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. This is necessary in order to ensure compliance with international standards, including the Arms Trade Treaty, the UN Firearms Protocol, the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms, and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. Particular efforts must be made to prevent the diversion of small arms and light weapons and their ammunition to conflict and post-conflict zones, where conflict-related sexual violence is especially widespread. 2. We must not work in silos. WPS agenda is highly relevant when addressing arms proliferation. One way to integrate them is by incorporating provisions from relevant articles of the Arms Trade Treaty and other relevant documents into national action plans on WTPS and by adopting a gender-responsive approach in national policies on arms control. 3. Women remain highly underrepresented in international discussions on arms control and disarmament issues. However, their perspectives are essential for developing gender-responsive policies and strategies, and to prevent the misuse of weapons for all forms of sexual and gender-based violence, including in the context of conflict. Therefore, we call for the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women in all processes and decision-making related to arms control and disarmament. Mr. President, Slovenia strongly condemns sexual and gender-based violence. We call upon all parties to any conflict to immediately cease all forms of conflict-related sexual violence. Response to any such violence must be rights-based and survivor-centered. It should include access to and availability of sexual and reproductive health services, as well as psychosocial support for survivors. We are appalled by the fact that impunity remains the norm, contributing to the creation of an environment conducive to the perpetration of sexual violence. We urge all member states to increase efforts to guarantee accountability for these crimes. This can be done through deployment of the UN team of special experts on the rule of law and sexual violence and women protection advisors to assist national justice systems in conflict-affected societies. It is also important that survivors have access to justice in a safe and secure environment, where they can report the violence, feel safe, and receive adequate legal support. This Security Council should do more to address sexual and gender-based violence comprehensively. One such avenue is a more systematic integration of gender and sanctions regimes by including sexual and gender-based violence as a designation criterion for targeted sanctions in all relevant regimes. We also reiterate our call to all states and actors to comply with existing arms embargoes put in place by this Council in order to limit the availability and accessibility of arms. Mr. President, women and girls are so much more than victims or survivors of this violence. They are peace builders, frontline responders, and they have a critical role in providing much-needed services to women and girls in conflict or post-conflict situations. We therefore strongly support women's voices from the field. We call for consultations with women and women-led organizations and condemn any attempt to intimidate and silence them. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement, and the representative of the United States has now asked for the floor to make a further comment. I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Ambassador Thomas Greenfield has just asked me to specifically thank our civil society briefer, Ms. Ahmadi, and specifically thank you for your very important work in Sudan. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further comment. I give you the floor.
Thank you, President. It would seem that we had a very useful discussion today, helping us to figure out what method is unfortunately being used at the United Nations. What method is being used to politicize this very important topic. It's really a broken mirror. And throughout the discussion, we heard the US, the UK admit, for instance, that they're conducting investigations of some kind in Ukraine, investigations of sexual crimes. It goes without saying that everyone knows that the US and the UK are not neutral organizations of some sort. They have their own political interests in Ukraine. Therefore, it's absolutely clear what kind of results they're going to get when they run these investigations. They're not interested in pointing the finger at Ukraine and the Ukrainian armed forces. The information they collect is then submitted to the so-called monitoring mission in Ukraine. Now, this monitoring mission is completely under Kiev's control. The head of that organization is too scared to say anything that's not to Kiev's liking. After that, this information, this data, makes its way into reports authored by Ms. Pramila Patten. And that's the picture we get. For instance, access to Gaza, the Gaza Strip, is restricted. And for some reason, no one's that interested in going to Gaza to see for themselves what this situation is as regards various crimes, including sexual crimes. And then, as a consequence, this report is really a broken mirror. It doesn't give us the real play, the state of play regarding these crimes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now wish to remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 4 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. Flashing lights on the colors of your microphone will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 4 minutes. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Nuno Sapien, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Portugal. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Portugal thanks Malta for convening this very important and timely debate. We also thanks all the briefing report and all the work done by the special representative. And we thanks very, very special the insights and the testimonies that we have heard here today of Mrs. Ahmadi and Mrs. Gurira. Thank you very much. Mr. President, as noted in the Secretary General's last report, increasing geopolitical tensions and the escalation of armed conflicts have exposed civilians to higher levels of conflict-related sexual violence. Women and girls continue to be disproportionately affected by sexual violence, and their voices continue to be silenced or absent from key decision-making forums on peace and security issues. Portugal strongly condemns the use of sexual violence by state and non-state actors as a tactic of war, torture, and terrorism in armed conflicts. We oppose all forms of violence against women. Arms proliferation and illicit traffic by armed groups, organized crime, and terrorist groups exacerbate violence, oppression, and abuse, especially against women and persons belonging to vulnerable groups. We need a survivor-centered approach when responding to conflict-related sexual violence, ensuring that access to medical, psychological, and legal support. But we need, first and foremost, to prevent conflict-related sexual violence, which requires a multifaceted approach. It must include demilitarization, gender-responsive arms control, and the empowerment of all women and girls. Furthermore, this imperative of preventing CRSV should be an integral part of the new generation of national conflict prevention strategies, timely suggested by the Secretary General in his new agenda for peace. Mr. President, as we approach the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Resolution 3025, we recall its significance in highlighting the impact of armed conflict on women and emphasizing the crucial importance of women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in the prevention, management, and resolution of conflicts. Within the United Nations, we must deepen and strengthen the women, peace, and security agenda by integrating gender-sensitive indicators, analysis, and measures into disarmament policies, ensuring women's participation and peace-building initiatives, and supporting women's leadership roles in civil society and grassroots organizations. Mr. President, at the national level, Portugal has adopted a national action plan on women, peace and security, the fourth edition of which is being prepared and has integrated a gender perspective into the Portuguese armed forces. In closing, we reaffirm our strong commitment to promoting security, sustainable peace, and gender equality, thereby preventing the emergence of conflicts and ensuring the equal and full enjoyment of human rights by all women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Minister Sampaio, for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Malta for holding this important meeting and to appreciate the focus of the discussion on the prevention component and the particular emphasis on arms control, demilitarization, and disarmament. I thank the briefers as well for their valuable inputs. My delegation is deeply alarmed by the findings of the SG report indicating the persistent use of sexual violence as a tactic of war amplified by the proliferation of conflicts in various regions.
Mr. President, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, including aspects related to sexual violence in armed conflict, is not limited to discussions on the participation of women along the peace continuum and the empowerment of civil society. It's about making the voice of women, victims of violence and various forms of atrocities well heard, as well as achieving justice by establishing and guaranteeing accountability and ending impunity for such violence and atrocities. Efforts should address holistically the root causes of conflict and focus on prevention while fully taking into consideration the social, economic, political, and developmental aspects. Mr. President, despite years of engagement by the UN system, member states, and other relevant stakeholders on the WPS, the international community is still unable to prevent conflicts or stop it, and unable to prevent violence against women and girls in situations of armed conflicts. And upholding the rights of women in such similar settings, in particular, women and girls under foreign occupation, a case in point being Palestinian women who are currently being disproportionately subjected to violence, in fact, annihilation, in the current genocidal war of aggression launched by Israel, the occupying power, against Gaza. This is in addition to the long-standing systemic atrocities and violations of the rights of Palestinian women in the occupied Palestinian territory, including in the West Bank. In this connection, my delegation appreciates the first time added section on Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. It is a long overdue addition, as the international community, including the UN, has kept a blind eye for years on reported allegations of violence, including sexual violence and violations committed by Israel, the occupying power, against Palestinians. We take note of the official visit carried out by Ms. Pramila Patten, the SRSG on sexual violence in conflict regarding the attacks of 7th of October. I quote from the report that the mission, not being investigative in nature and given its limited duration, did not draw conclusions on attributions to specific armed groups or determine prevalence of incidents of conflict-related sexual violence during and after the attacks of October 7th. Such a determination would require a fully fledged investigation, end of quote. Such an investigation, Mr. President, is difficult to be conducted while the war continues, while civilians are being bombarded and humanitarian actors are attacked by Israel with impunity, regrettably. And as for the situation in the West Bank, my delegation echoes the call of the SG to the government of Israel to grant without further delay access to relevant UN bodies to carry out a fully fledged investigation into all alleged violations, including conflict-related sexual violence, to ensure justice and accountability. Egypt remains committed to efforts aimed at ending the current war of aggression on Gaza and calls for immediate ceasefire, unhindered humanitarian access, ending the plight of Palestinians, and holding Israel accountable as the perpetrator of those attacks, and the establishment of independent state of Palestine on the borders of 4th of June 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. Mr. President, my delegation is equally alarmed by reports of atrocities committed in the Sudan, including sexual violence at the wake of the current war raging in the country, particularly with evidenced UN reports of sexual violence committed in the Darfur region, as we also listen today. Egypt condemns such atrocities and calls for immediate ceasefire, facilitated humanitarian access, respect for Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, preservation of state and institutions, respect of international humanitarian
rights laws, commitment by external actors to refrain from intervention in the domestic affairs of Sudan, including through arms transfer to the Republic of Sudan and other armed groups that further fuel the conflict, and a return to a Sudan-led and owned political process. Egypt remains committed to reaching those ends through sustained engagement, cooperation and coordination with the UN, neighboring states and other actors in the region. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Egypt for his statement and ask the representative of Yemen to take the floor.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. اسمحوا لي في البداية أن أشكركم على
Thank you, President. At the outset, we should like to thank you for convening this very important meeting. We also wish to thank the briefers. President, sexual violence is a serious violation of human rights. This violence is being used in conflict settings. And they are therefore the worst crimes that can be committed in a society. They have an impact on freedom, but also on social cohesion, as well as security and stability, the economy, political and social life as well. They therefore have a clear knock-on effect on families as well. The Presidential Leadership Council, ever since it was appointed, has taken important decisions to bolster the participation of Yemeni women. 8 women were appointed to provide technical assistance and expertise to one of the committees of this council with a view to achieving lasting peace. For the first time, a woman was appointed as a member of the Supreme Judicial Council. 8 magistrates were appointed to the Supreme Council, and 271 women were also appointed, including 37 prosecutor generals. The government has also introduced a national plan on WPS, working hand in hand with relevant government institutions and civil society organizations with a view to protecting women during and in post-conflict situations as well, so they can contribute to socioeconomic development. The Yemeni government also attaches particular importance to preventing sexual violence. It's worked on this by improving control, verification, equity mechanisms, as well as providing assistance to the victims of sexual violence. Legal assistance is provided through the Union of Yemeni Women across a number of governorates. Furthermore, our government has provided the National Commission tasked with investigating allegations of human rights violations. And in fact, for that commission to properly do its work, the Leadership Council is working hand in hand with that commission to facilitate its work and to ensure that the recommendations it issues are implemented to promote human rights. Terrorists and various militias continue to violate international humanitarian law and international human rights law. This has been reported in national documents and also in various international human rights reports. What's more is the group of experts on Yemen and the SRSG on sexual violence in conflict also mentioned such violence being committed in Yemen. Terrorists have exploited the symbol of woman in Yemeni society. Many violations were committed against women. Women have been stripped of their political, economic, social, and cultural rights. They're kidnapped, they're detained in secret prisons. What's more is we've seen instances of rape, torture, both physical and psychological, in addition to attempts that were made to tarnish the reputation of some women, to blackmail women because of their political affiliation or their civil society involvement. Many women remain behind bars in the prisons of these terrorist organizations. Many of them are being subjected to unfair sentences. They're incarcerated in an unfair fashion. Millions of mines and munitions remain on our roads, near schools, near wells containing drinking water. As a result, many neighborhoods have been rendered uninhabitable. They're dangerous. And this concerns a number of Yemeni governorates. No one expected that this phenomenon would have such far-reaching consequences, especially for civilians, especially women and children. According to UN statistics, over the last 5 years, every 3 days, a child is injured or killed owing to unexploded remnants of war or mines. This is on average. We call on the Security Council to condemn this very dangerous practice which threatens security and stability in Yemen as well as international peace and security. The perpetrators of these acts must be brought to justice. President, we cannot but mention violence affecting Palestinian women as well as their rights. This is owing to the Israeli occupation. Thousands of women are affected by crimes against humanity, genocide, and this aggression that's been waged on the Palestinian people, specifically in Gaza. It's incumbent on the international community and the Security Council to take immediate action to achieve a ceasefire and to ensure that we put an end to these serious violations of the rights of women, girls, children. These violations are a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. By way of conclusion, Mr. President, international cooperation in order to address conflict-related sexual violence is a key pillar of our efforts to achieve lasting change for women and girls. We need to exchange information, expertise, so as to ensure that there's technical assistance as well to promote the implementation of WPS national plans, specifically in countries, in conflict settings or post-conflict situations. This will help us to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. I thank you.
I thank the representative of
أشكر سعادة ممثلة اليمن على بيانها والكلمة الآن لغواتيمالا. تفضلوا.
Guatemala would like to thank the government of the Republic of Malta as well as the Deputy Prime Minister for presiding over this open debate. We are also grateful to the Special Representative, the Goodwill Ambassador for UN Women, and the civil society representative for their important statements. We must recognize that CRSV is not just an inevitable byproduct of war. It is a tactic of war, and it is a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and must be unequivocally condemned. In addressing this issue, we must have a holistic approach and recognize that we need to work on prevention, protection for victims, and accountability for perpetrators. This can only be achieved if we involve relevant actors, international organizations, government, civil society, and impacted communities. We must strengthen laws and accountability mechanisms and guarantee the meaningful participation of women in the peace process, as well as promote education and awareness raising about human rights and gender equality from a very young age. The national action plans are a vital outcome of this Council's Resolution 1325. States are to implement their commitments to civil society and meet the needs and priorities of countries currently impacted by conflicts or countries which are in post-conflict situations. Resolution 1820 called on the parties in armed conflicts, including non-state actors, to protect civilians from sexual violence, and it urges the PBC to consider the impact of sexual violence related to conflict on early recovery and peace building in the long term. Conflict situations with the additional problems of institutional weakness, impunity, and the proliferation of weapons seriously increase the risks of gender and sexual-based violence. In the new agenda for peace, there is an attempt to reduce military spending, the impact of weapons on women, men, girls, and boys. In the agenda on disarmament, we recognize the proliferation, the deviation, and the misuse of these weapons allow for terrorist acts, the abuse of human rights, and gender-based violence, and therefore measures aimed at demilitarization, disarmament, and arms control can limit the likelihood that acts of sexual violence will be carried out against civilians, particularly women and girls. We must recall the vital role of dialogue and diplomacy as central to promoting and ensuring the peaceful resolution of conflicts. We must strengthen the support provided to victims of sexual violence by providing medical care, psychological care, legal assistance, and socioeconomic rehabilitation. These must be made accessible and they must be culturally sensitive. It is our responsibility to remove any barriers and strengthen the role of women and include women in the peace process in the area of prevention and conflict resolution and peace building. I reiterate once again the commitment of Guatemala to continue to fully implement Resolution 1325 and related resolutions. This is one of the main reasons why we have put forward our candidacy to the Security Council for 2031 through 2032. Thank you. Thank you, distinguished Deputy Prime Minister.
I thank the representative of Guatemala for her statement. We had a hard stop for 1 o'clock for this session, but we've paused that by a couple of minutes. And however, there are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting, and therefore I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until this afternoon at 3 p.m. This meeting is suspended.